Welcome back everybody to our studies in AQA A-level history. This video is going to spend some time talking about the 1959 general election. We're getting to the end of it, we're getting through them, and so just as a basic background, we know already that in 1955 we get the resignation of Winston Churchill, we get the ascendancy of Anthony Eden, and then we get the 1955 general election. We get a quite short period of time when Eden is Prime Minister, when he is then replaced in 1957 by Harold Macmillan. Harold Macmillan does not immediately call a general election. He keeps it basically in the back pocket because, of course, that would mean another general election within a couple of years of the 1955 general election. Not even that, basically a year. And so fundamentally then, the political background that we see here is that after the Suez Crisis in 1956, we know that the government of Anthony Eden begins to fall. Harold Macmillan succeeds him in 1957. On the other side of the aisle, fundamentally, you've got leadership takeover by Hugh Gaitskell. In 1955, the Labour Party is still split between the Bevernites and the Gaitskellites. And you also have the Liberal Party, which is still, coming up in third place, a relatively small percentage, but still enough to maybe even take some seats away from the Conservatives or the Labour Party in some areas. The Labour Party is led in 1956 by Joe Grimond. Now, initially, when looking at going into this election in 1959, you can see that Labour initially are leading in the polls, but the economy is recovering. The economy begins to recover after the recession of 1958, which boosts the fortunes of the Conservatives. And so by autumn 1958, Macmillan is now back in the lead and retaken the lead in terms of Labour's popularity. And so when it comes to the 1959 general election, it's still quite close. It's a lot closer than the 1955 general election. 1955 general election, everyone's high on post-war productivity and post-war positivity. Everyone's happy and on all these different kinds of things. It's a little bit different in 1959. The Conservatives, however, did capitalise on a relatively buoyant economy with various different slogans, such as "You've never had it so good." This wasn't an official slogan that was used, ironically, but it was a sort of slogan that was very heavily associated with Macmillan and heavily associated with Macmillan's government. So despite, ironically, not being used as an official slogan, it almost became the de facto official slogan in time. You also have slogans such as "Life is better with the Conservatives," "Don't let Labour ruin it," and of course, like I said, that "You've never had it so good" line. When it comes to Labour's manifesto, the manifesto was titled "Britain Belongs to You," and it focused on expanding social welfare, restoring pension increases, strengthening the NHS and spending for the NHS, renationalising steel and haulage, again a policy that was popular in the 1955 general election campaign, or at least popular for Labour at least, and also the establishment of a Welsh office. And it notably shifted away then from what was a sort of quite fully or quite strong socialist policy towards a type of welfare capitalist policy. The idea of expanding the welfare state, nationalising industry, having quite large government infrastructure and spending, but doing so within a more capitalistic framework and environment, less what you would describe as fully socialism, so we say. Now, this obviously reflects the fact that Gaitskell was more moderate within the Labour Party and had sort of taken over control compared to that of Bevan, who was a lot more socialist in terms of his political ideology. And Gaitskell himself claimed that he would not raise taxes under a Labour government, despite making spending pledges. Now, I know some of you are going to be voting in the future and will be voting in general elections in time. One of the things that often happens is that people will, or governments or political parties will make spending pledges while also making pledges to not raise taxes, which is always an interesting question because one of the ways in which you can actually pay for spending pledges is through the raising of taxes. And a lot of manifestos tend to try and have their cake and eat it too and say we want to not raise taxes because that's positive, and also we're going to make spending pledges, which is also positive. So just bear that in mind when thinking about voting for particular candidates, that if they say they're going to make spending pledges and they also say they're not going to raise taxes, you have to think about, well, where's that money going to come from? If they explain it, then that's perfectly fine. But if they don't explain it, then that's a little bit of a red flag. Of course, this is going to undermine the fact that people aren't going to have that much confidence in the fiscal credibility of the Labour Party in 1959, because they're saying we're gonna spend all this money, we're gonna strengthen NHS spending, we're gonna increase pensions, we're gonna renationalise steel and haulage, and we're gonna do all of these different kinds of things, and also your taxes aren't going to go up to pay for it at all. And so we see that this is not a very good policy. And it really did damage Gatescale quite a lot, claiming this particular line of policy essentially. And so when we get to the results of the election, we see that there were about 27 million votes cast, which is a turnout of roughly 78%, which is consistent with high levels of participation in the 1950s. It, of course, it is a drop in and a downward shift in terms of turnout from the sort of 80% in 83%, shall we say, in 1950. 82% in 1951, 76% in 1955, and now slight increase, a slight upturn from 1955 to 1959, but again was a sort of downward trend more generally from the 1950s out of the 80% and now into the 70%, but in the high 70s still. We couldn't even dream of having turnout rates as good as this today. It would be amazing if we could have turnout rates as high as 80% in the UK in today's general elections. I believe that our turnout rates nowadays barely make the 60%, maybe mid 60s. I'll have to have a look, but generally speaking, that they're a lot lower than they are in the 1950s and 1960s. We also see a number of firsts for this particular election, in the sense that this was the first time that Margaret Thatcher entered Parliament as MP for Finchley. This is obviously very, very important. We also see that Jeremy Thorpe made his debut and became Liberal leader in time. And despite winning the largest share of the vote in Scotland, Conservatives failed to win most of the seats there. This is a feat that they haven't actually been able to repeat since this election had taken place. But it was another Conservative victory. Again, another Conservative victory in terms of voter results. And in the next lesson, what I'm going to do is spend some time talking about the role of Macmillan as Prime Minister, before then diving into other aspects of the specification, thinking about internal Labour divisions, thinking about the economics of stop-go, thinking about youth culture, and then we'll finish by looking at the Suez Crisis before moving on to the 1960s.